Do you think Santa's always been merry and kind? Think again. The true story of where he came from is darker, scarier, and way more twisted than any holiday movie dares to show. Before Santa became the beloved figure we celebrate today, he was something else entirely. He was a Norse god riding through winter storms, a stern bishop judging the souls of children, a figure accompanied not by cheerful elves but by demons, monsters, and witches who carried switches and chains. For centuries, the story of Santa wasn't about cookies and milk. It was about fear, punishment, and the thin line between reward and retribution. So buckle up, because we're about to peel back the layers of one of the world's most famous figures and reveal the shocking, sometimes disturbing truth about where Santa Claus really comes from. This isn't the story they tell you in shopping malls. This is the real deal. Let's start at the very beginning, long before Christianity, long before St. Nicholas, in the frozen lands of Scandinavia where the Norse gods ruled. If you want to understand Santa Claus, you need to understand Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and magic. Because the parallels between Odin and Santa are so striking that they can't be ignored. Picture this: the dead of winter, the longest nights of the year, and the Norse people huddled in their homes as a terrible sound fills the air. It's the Wild Hunt, and leading it is Odin himself, riding across the sky on his 8-legged horse Sleipnir. The wind howls, the ground shakes, and anyone foolish enough to be caught outside risks being swept up by the ghostly procession and carried away to join the hunt forever. This wasn't a fairy tale. To the Norse, this was real. The Wild Hunt was an omen of death, war, and disaster. Now think about Santa for a moment. He travels across the sky during winter. He rides in a vehicle pulled by 8 creatures, just like Odin's 8-legged horse. He knows who's been naughty or nice, just as Odin was all-knowing, with his 2 ravens Hugin and Munin flying across the world to report back to him. He even demands offerings. Remember leaving out cookies and milk for Santa? That tradition comes directly from Norse children leaving hay and straw for Sleipnir. In return, Odin might leave small gifts or trinkets. Both figures are old men with long white beards. Both are associated with winter and the darkest time of the year. Both travel at night, and both have an otherworldly, almost magical quality about them. Odin was the god of Yule, the Norse winter solstice celebration that eventually became Christmas. So when people say Santa has pagan roots, they're not exaggerating. The blueprint was written 1,000 years before the jolly old elf ever existed. But Odin wasn't a gift giver in the way Santa is. He was a god of war and death. His generosity came with strings attached, and that dual nature, that sense of reward and punishment, would carry forward into every version of Santa that came after him. Now let's jump ahead several centuries to the 4th century in the ancient city of Myra, located in what is now Turkey. This is where we meet St. Nicholas, the man who would eventually become the foundation for Santa Claus as we know him. But let me be clear, St. Nicholas was nothing like the Santa you see in department stores. Nicholas was a Christian bishop, a man of deep faith and conviction. He was born into a wealthy family, but instead of hoarding his riches, he gave them away. The most famous story about him involves 3 sisters whose father was so poor he couldn't afford dowries for them to marry. Without dowries, these girls faced a grim future, possibly being sold into slavery or worse. St. Nicholas heard about their plight and decided to help. On 3 separate nights, he secretly threw bags of gold through their window, one for each daughter. This act of anonymous generosity saved the family and became the foundation for the tradition of secret gift-giving. But here's what's important. St. Nicholas wasn't doing this because it was Christmas. December 25th meant nothing to him. His feast day was December 6th, the day he died, and that's when people celebrated him. He wasn't associated with chimneys or reindeer or workshops. He was a bishop, a religious figure, someone who cared deeply about justice and charity. And Nicholas had a darker side too. There's a legend, perhaps true, perhaps not, that at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, Nicholas got so angry at a heretic named Arius for denying the divinity of Christ that he walked across the room and slapped him in the face. Imagine Santa Claus slapping someone at a church council. That's the real St. Nicholas, a man of passion, conviction, and righteous anger. Another story tells of Nicholas saving 3 innocent men from execution after their trial was rigged. He confronted the corrupt officials and demanded justice. He was also said to have calmed a storm at sea, saving sailors from certain death. These weren't the acts of a jolly elf. They were the acts of a powerful, fearless man who stood up for what was right. But here's where things get really interesting. After Nicholas died, his legend grew and grew. By the Middle Ages, he had become one of the most popular saints in all of Europe, especially in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. Churches were built in his honor. His feast day on December 6th became a major holiday, and that's when the transformation began. In the Netherlands, Saint Nicholas became Sinterklaas, and his story took on a whole new dimension. He was no longer just a charitable bishop. He became a figure of judgment, a moral enforcer who rewarded good children and punished bad ones. Sinterklaas arrived every year on December 5th, not from the North Pole, but from Spain, riding a white horse named Amerigo. He carried a large book that listed every child's behavior throughout the year. If you were good, you received gifts. If you were bad, well, you might receive a lump of coal, a bundle of sticks, or worse. And Sinterklaas didn't come alone. He was accompanied by helpers, including a controversial figure known as Zwarte Piet or Black Pete. This character, dressed in elaborate clothing and with a darkened face, would help deliver gifts but also served as an enforcer, someone who would discipline naughty children. The tradition is still celebrated in the Netherlands today, though it has become a source of significant controversy and debate. But Sinterklaas wasn't the only companion figure associated with St. Nicholas. In fact, across Europe, Nicholas was accompanied by some of the most terrifying creatures you can imagine. And this is where the story gets really dark. Let's talk about Krampus. If you've never heard of Krampus, prepare yourself. Originating in the Alpine regions of Austria, Bavaria, and other parts of Central Europe, Krampus is a demonic figure with horns, hooves, a long tongue, and chains. His name comes from the German word Krampen, meaning claw. While St. Nicholas rewarded the good children, Krampus punished the bad ones. And I don't mean a slap on the wrist. I mean real, terrifying punishment. Krampus carried birch switches to beat naughty children. He dragged chains to make a terrifying sound as he approached. And most frightening of all, he carried a large sack or basket on his back, where he would stuff the very worst children and carry them away, never to be seen again. Some versions of the story say he took them to his lair in the mountains. Others say he dragged them straight to hell. For centuries, children in Alpine villages lived in genuine fear of Krampus. On the night of December 5th, known as Krampusnacht, people would dress up as Krampus and roam the streets, rattling chains and frightening children into obedience. The message was clear: behave, or Krampus will come for you. This wasn't a cute holiday tradition. This was psychological terror designed to keep children in line. And Krampus wasn't alone. Let me introduce you to Belsnickel, another companion of St. Nicholas who appeared in Germanic folklore and was brought to America by German immigrants in the 1700s. The name Belsnickel comes from Bellen, meaning to whip, and Nickel, a nickname for Nicholas. Belsnickel was a ragged, dirty figure dressed in furs and torn clothing. He would arrive at homes before Christmas and question children directly about their behavior. Were you good this year? Did you obey your parents? Did you do your chores? If you answered honestly and had been good, Belsnickel might give you candy or small treats. But if you lied, or if he determined you'd been bad, he would strike you with his switches. Unlike Santa, who makes his judgments from afar, Belsnickel was in your face, demanding answers, and the consequences were immediate. Now, if you think Krampus and Belsnickel are scary, let me tell you about Frau Perkta, also known as Perkta or the Christmas Witch. She is, without question, one of the most terrifying figures associated with the Christmas season, and her legend goes back to pre-Christian times in the Alpine regions. Perkta was originally a pagan goddess associated with nature, spinning, and the winter season. Her name means bright or shining. But don't let that fool you. When Christianity spread through Europe, many pagan deities were demonized, and Perkta was no exception. She became a figure of judgment who roamed the countryside during the 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th. Perkta's appearance could change. Sometimes she appeared as a beautiful young woman dressed in white, glowing with an ethereal light. Other times, she took the form of a hideous old crone with wild hair, a hooked nose, and one large foot, often described as a goose foot, which symbolized her connection to the natural world and her shape-shifting abilities. But it was her punishments that made Perchta truly terrifying. She would visit homes to inspect how hard people had worked during the year, especially women and their spinning. If you had finished your work and followed the old traditions, Perchta might leave a small coin or gift. But if you had been lazy or disobedient, the punishment was unspeakable. Perchta would slit open your belly, remove your internal organs, and stuff your body cavity with straw and broken glass. So let's recap for a moment. The origins of Santa Claus are rooted in Odin, a god of war and death who led the wild hunt. Then we have Saint Nicholas, a stern bishop who cared about justice and charity. And surrounding Nicholas in European tradition were figures like Krampus, Belsnickel, and Frau Perchta, demons and witches who enforced morality through fear, violence, and terror. This is the shocking origin of Santa Claus. This is where the story really begins. In the coming years, the idea of a jolly old man giving gifts and spreading joy became a talking point. But there was still one problem. No one knew what Santa Claus actually looked like. Moore's poem described him as an elf, but artists and illustrators depicted him in all sorts of ways. He was tall, he was short, he was thin, he was fat. He wore red, green, blue, brown, even yellow. There was no consistency, and that's where Thomas Nast comes in. Thomas Nast was a political cartoonist working for Harper's Weekly magazine in the 1860s. Nast began drawing Santa Claus as part of his Christmas illustrations, and over the course of several decades, he created the visual image of Santa that we recognize today. Nast's Santa was no longer an elf. He was a full-sized man, plump and jolly, with a long white beard and a red suit trimmed with white fur. Nast also added new details to the legend. He depicted Santa living at the North Pole, working in a workshop filled with toys, keeping a list of naughty and nice children, and watching over the world through a telescope to see who had been good. Nast's illustrations appeared in Harper's Weekly throughout the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and they became wildly popular. For the first time, people had a clear, consistent image of what Santa Claus looked like and where he lived. Nast's Santa was the Santa of the Gilded Age, a figure perfectly suited to an America that was becoming more industrialized, more commercial, and more focused on consumerism. But even Nast's Santa wasn't quite the Santa we know today. There was still one more step in the evolution, one final transformation that would lock Santa's image in place forever. And that transformation came in 1931, thanks to a Swedish-American artist named Haddon Sundblom and a little company called Coca-Cola. Santa represents something deeper than just a man in a red suit. He represents generosity, kindness, magic, and the belief that good behavior will be rewarded. He represents the idea that, at least once a year, the world can be a little bit better, a little bit brighter, a little bit more joyful. And yes, he also represents the power of storytelling, the way cultures adapt and change their myths to fit the times. That Santa's story is a reminder that nothing is static. Even the most beloved traditions have dark, complicated origins. Even the most cheerful figures have shadows in their past. And that's okay, because the beauty of folklore is that it evolves. It changes. It reflects who we are and who we want to be. Till next time, see you on the next episode.